Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. I was sitting at my usual corner booth in a quiet upscale restaurant, sipping on my glass of red wine and reflecting on the events of the week. It had been a long and challenging few days, filled with back-to-back meetings, business deals, and the constant pressure that comes with managing my growing company. But that evening, I had set aside time to enjoy a rare moment of peace in a place I frequented for its calm ambience and exquisite food. Little did I know, what I was about to witness would change not only my evening, but my entire perspective on life. The soft murmur of conversations surrounded me, with clinking glasses and laughter filling the air. As I scanned the room, my eyes caught sight of a young girl sitting alone at a table near the window. She couldn't have been older than 12 or 13, and there was something about her presence that made me look twice. She was dressed in a simple, faded dress that was far from the polished attire the other patrons wore. Her hair, though beautifully natural, was tangled and unruly, as though she had spent the day running through the streets or hiding away from the world. Despite her appearance, there was a certain grace to her, a quiet strength in her eyes that I couldn't quite explain. She was alone, but she seemed perfectly at ease. The waiter came by, asking if she needed anything, but she shook her head. My curiosity was piqued. I had been coming to this restaurant for years, and I had never seen this girl before. Who was she? Why was she here, by herself, in such an expensive place? And then, something caught my attention. A few minutes later, a well-dressed man walked into the restaurant. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a sharp suit, and carried himself with the air of someone who had seen the world and achieved success. He was a regular at this place, one of the kind of businessmen whose name everyone knew. His presence commanded respect, and his very appearance made it clear that he was accustomed to being treated like royalty. As he made his way toward the hostess stand, he noticed the young girl sitting by the window. There was something about the way he looked at her, a strange moment of recognition that flashed in his eyes. It was as if he saw something in her, something familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. He hesitated for a second, then walked toward her table, and I watched in silence, my curiosity growing even more intense. The young girl, who had been absent-mindedly playing with the straw in her glass, suddenly looked up. Their eyes locked. And for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The room around me felt distant, as if I were watching a scene unfold in slow motion. Then she stood up from her seat, and to my surprise, she shouted 4 words that would alter the course of both their lives. "You don't know me, do you?" The man froze, his face blank for a brief second. His hand, which had been halfway to his jacket pocket, paused midair. It was as if her words had struck a chord deep inside him. There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, just a calm, knowing clarity. She had spoken with such certainty, as though she understood something he had long buried in his past. For a few moments, the man just stood there, staring at her, unable to speak. The girl's gaze didn't waver. She looked at him with a kind of intensity that felt almost otherworldly. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to react, waiting for something to happen. The silence in the restaurant grew heavier, and every single person in the room seemed to be watching this unfolding drama, waiting for what would come next. Finally, the man cleared his throat. He took a step toward her and spoke, his voice trembling just slightly. How do you know my name?" he asked, his eyes now wide with confusion. The young girl smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't know your name," she replied softly. "But I know who you are. I know what you did." And just like that, my mind began racing. What did she mean? What did she know? Who was this young girl? And how could she have this kind of impact on a man who appeared to have it all? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. The man stood still for a moment, lost in thought, his face slowly shifting from confusion to something else, something deeper, more vulnerable. I couldn't quite place it, but it was clear that the girl's words had touched a nerve. He swallowed hard, as though trying to gather himself, and then something unexpected happened. He sat down at her table. The waiter, who had been hovering in the background, hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. But the man waved him off, and the young girl motioned for him to sit. It was an odd moment, almost surreal. And yet, there was an undeniable weight in the air, as though this was a moment of reckoning, a moment of truth. As the man sat down, he let out a deep sigh and ran a hand through his hair, as if trying to compose himself. "You have me at a loss," he admitted. "I don't know who you are, and yet, something about you feels so familiar." The girl's eyes softened, and for the first time since their interaction began, a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She leaned forward slightly and spoke the next words with the kind of certainty that only comes from lived experience. "I'm the daughter of a woman you once knew, a woman you once loved." The words hit the man like a punch to the gut. His face paled, and for a moment, he looked as if the world had just been ripped out from under him. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between disbelief and the slow realization of something long forgotten. The girl continued, her voice steady and calm. "My mother, she was your first love. You promised her that you would always be there for her, but when she needed you most, you disappeared. She died a few years ago, and I was left alone." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I've been alone ever since." The restaurant seemed to grow even quieter as the girl's story unfolded. No one dared to make a sound. I could feel the tension between the two of them, an undeniable connection, a shared history that had been buried for far too long. The man's eyes were now filled with regret, and the reality of what had been revealed was beginning to hit him hard. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just an ordinary encounter. This was something much deeper. The girl wasn't just looking for answers. She was looking for a chance at redemption, for herself and for him. She wanted him to know the truth, to face the consequences of his past choices. But the most powerful part of this exchange wasn't the revelation of who she was. It was the courage and strength in her voice. This girl, who had every reason to be bitter, angry, and resentful, was choosing instead to confront her past with grace and dignity. It was as if she knew that her future wasn't defined by the mistakes of others, but by how she chose to rise above them. And as I watched this conversation unfold, I felt a deep sense of admiration for her. This was the moment that would change both of their lives, whether the man realized it or not. It was a moment of reckoning, but also of opportunity. An opportunity for redemption, for both of them. The story was just beginning. The man sat there, his face frozen in disbelief, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, betrayed a storm of emotions that swirled beneath the surface. The young girl's words, so matter-of-fact and direct, had shattered something inside him, something he had buried deep for years. His posture, once confident and commanding, now seemed fragile, like a man whose very foundation had been shaken. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around us seemed to blur as I watched this silent exchange unfold. The girl, whose name I still didn't know, was still and composed, her gaze unwavering as she looked at him. It was clear she wasn't seeking an apology, nor was she looking for sympathy. Her strength radiated from her, and yet there was something in her eyes, a deep well of pain that she carried with her, a burden she had borne alone for far too long. And then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime, the man spoke. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he fought to maintain control. "I never wanted to hurt her, or you. But life, it's not always as simple as we hope." The girl didn't react to his words immediately. She merely observed him with an expression that could have been mistaken for indifference, but there was an underlying current of empathy in her gaze, an understanding that transcended the pain of the past. She had seen enough of life to know that people made choices, some of them regrettable, others inevitable. But more than that, she knew that healing only began when the truth was laid bare. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I'm here because I want you to understand something. I want you to know who I am, and who my mother was." The man looked at her, as if he were struggling to find the right words, but none seemed to come. His face betrayed a deep, gnawing regret, as though he had been carrying this burden for far too long, hoping it would fade with time. But time, it seemed, had done nothing to lessen the weight of his choices. "I was young," he said slowly, as if justifying himself. "I had everything: money, power, influence. And your mother, she was different. She was the one person who made me feel like I mattered beyond all of that, that I let fear, ambition, and everything else cloud my judgment. I left her. And when I came back, she was gone." He paused, taking a deep breath, and then continued, his voice quieter now. "I've lived with that guilt every day of my life, but I've never had the courage to face it. And now you're here, sitting across from me, and it feels like the past has finally caught up to me." The girl, still composed, nodded slowly. She had expected this, and yet hearing him speak those words, the words of regret, of acknowledgement, was almost surreal. It was as if the man she had once hoped would be a savior in her mother's life was now a mere reflection of a past she could never change. And yet there was no bitterness in her heart, no desire to see him suffer. She had learned long ago that carrying hatred only poisoned the soul. "You're right," she said after a long pause. "The past doesn't disappear. We can't erase it, no matter how hard we try, but we can choose how we move forward." The man's eyes flickered as he processed her words. "And what is it you want me to do? What do you expect from me?" "I expect nothing," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "But I do want you to understand what you've lost, and what you can still find, if you're willing to open your eyes." He stared at her, as though searching for some hidden meaning in her words. It was as if the weight of her presence, the gravity of this moment, was finally breaking through his defenses. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. It was a small, humble thing, not the kind of wallet you would expect from a man of his stature. He opened it carefully, as if handling something fragile, and pulled out a faded photograph. The photograph, though weathered and frayed at the edges, was unmistakable. It was of a woman, her mother, I presumed, standing in a garden, smiling with the same warmth and sincerity that I had seen in the girl's eyes. The man's hand trembled slightly as he looked at the picture, his face softening as memories flooded back. "I kept this," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I never threw it away. I couldn't. I always thought, maybe, one day, I'd find a way to make things right. But I never had the courage to face it, to face her, or you." The girl's expression remained steady, though a faint sadness seemed to flicker behind her gaze. "You don't need to make things right for me. I've learned to live without you. But my mother," she trailed off, her voice becoming softer. "She deserved more than what she got. And so do I." The silence between them was heavy now, filled with unspoken truths, regrets, and the fragile hope that something could still be salvaged from the wreckage of the past. I could see the internal struggle within the man. He was a man who had spent years building walls around himself, refusing to confront the choices that had led him here. But now, in the presence of this young girl, the walls were crumbling, bit by bit. She wasn't asking for a grand gesture or a lavish apology. She wasn't asking him to fix the past, because she understood that was impossible. What she was offering, in her quiet strength, was the possibility of healing, a chance for him to confront his own demons, and perhaps to find redemption in the most unexpected of places. "I'm sorry," the man said finally, his voice hoarse. "I should have been there for her, for both of you." The girl's expression softened, and for the first time in their conversation, a glimmer of something warmer appeared in her eyes. "It's never too late to make a change," she said, "but it has to come from within you. Not from guilt, but from a desire to do better." And then, with a small but purposeful motion, she stood up from the table. She didn't offer him a hug or any kind of physical reassurance. She simply stood, poised and dignified, as though she were giving him the space he needed to decide who he wanted to be moving forward. "I'll be waiting," she said, her voice steady. "I don't need anything from you right now, but I hope that one day you'll look at the woman I've become and realize that the person you abandoned was stronger than you ever gave her credit for." And with that, she turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the man alone with his thoughts. The man remained seated, his hands shaking ever so slightly. It was as if he were waking from a long, heavy sleep, unsure of how to face the new reality she had presented to him. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moments of redemption. But in that quiet, simple conversation, something had shifted within him. Something had stirred. And though I had only witnessed a fraction of their story, I knew that the course of their lives had been altered forever in that brief, pivotal encounter. The man's journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like he might just be willing to walk a different path, one toward healing, understanding, and perhaps, at long last, redemption. The man sat alone at the table for what seemed like hours, though in reality it was only a matter of minutes. His eyes were locked on the door through which the girl had just exited, and his mind was racing, scrambling to make sense of the moment that had just passed. The clinking of silverware and murmurs of conversation around him seemed distant, irrelevant, as if the entire world had narrowed down to just him and the young girl, his past and present colliding in a way he had never anticipated. I was still seated in my corner booth, observing from afar, unable to tear my eyes away from him. I had never seen a man so completely undone, so vulnerable. The man I had known, the one with the sharp suits, the confident demeanor, the air of authority, he was gone, replaced by a man who looked lost, even shattered. He sat there, hunched over, his elbows on the table, his face buried in his hands as if trying to shield himself from the weight of his own thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder about the girl. Who was she really? How had she managed to remain so composed, so dignified, despite the unimaginable pain she had endured? It was clear that she was more than just a child who had been abandoned. She had a quiet strength that spoke volumes, an understanding of life that most people, especially those who had grown up in privilege like the man, would never fully grasp. And in that brief encounter, she had somehow found the power to lay bare the truth of their shared history, exposing the raw, unhealed wounds that both of them carried. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally stood up. His movements were slow, as if he had to will his body into action. He took one last look at the table, almost as if he were trying to collect the pieces of a broken moment. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. I followed him with my eyes, sensing that whatever decision he made in the coming days, perhaps even the next few hours, would change the trajectory of his life forever. He was on the precipice of something important, something life-altering, but whether he would step forward or retreat into his past was still unclear. It wasn't until the next day that I learned just how deep the impact of that encounter had been. I had returned to the same restaurant, not for any particular reason, but because I had found myself lost in thought, consumed by the events of the night before. As I entered the quiet dining area, the hostess greeted me with a knowing smile, as though the presence of familiar faces was a rare comfort in an otherwise tumultuous world. I found my usual seat, but my mind wandered. The image of that girl, her unwavering strength, and the man, his brokenness, kept replaying in my mind. It was then that I overheard a conversation from a nearby table, a conversation that would change the course of my day, and perhaps my perspective on everything. I saw him earlier today. A man at the table next to mine was saying to his companion, "That billionaire. He's a mess." I glanced up, unable to ignore the mention of the man from the restaurant the night before. My curiosity piqued. I leaned in slightly, trying not to be too obvious, but the conversation was too captivating to ignore. "Did you see what happened when that girl confronted him?" the second man asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I've never seen him like that before. He was a wreck. No one even knows who she is. But whatever she said to him, it clearly hit hard." The first man nodded knowingly. "I heard she's his daughter. But not just any daughter. The one he abandoned all those years ago." I sat up straighter, my heart racing. This was more than just a random encounter. This was a story. A real, human story. And I was hearing it unfold right before my eyes. I had only witnessed a small fraction of the moment in the restaurant, but now I was hearing the pieces fall into place. The young girl, the man's estranged past, and the weight of decisions made long ago were converging in a way that I hadn't anticipated. "She showed up at his office this morning," the second man continued, almost in disbelief. "Apparently, she had been tracking him down for months. She said she had one thing to say to him, one thing that would change everything." "And he listened?" the first man asked, clearly astonished. The second man hesitated before answering. "At first, he didn't want to. But then, he looked at her, and I think for the first time in a long while, he saw the truth. And he knew he couldn't run from it anymore. I didn't know whether to feel stunned, heartbroken, or amazed. It was as if I had stumbled upon a story that was still being written. A story that had the potential to change lives. Not just the lives of the people directly involved, but of anyone who was fortunate enough to bear witness to it. I sat back, my mind racing with questions, each more urgent than the last. What would happen next? How would the man, now fully confronted with the truth, handle the situation? Could he really change? And what about the girl? What was her plan now that she had set this chain of events into motion? Was she prepared for the consequences of her actions? My thoughts were interrupted by a figure entering the restaurant, a man who exuded an air of authority and grace. I recognized him immediately. It was the man from the night before, the billionaire. But today, he was different. He seemed more composed, more focused. And as he made his way toward the hostess stand, I could see a faint resolve in his eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. He approached the hostess and asked to be seated at a table in the back. I watched him carefully as he settled into his seat, his posture straighter now, as if the weight of the world had been momentarily lifted. But despite the calm exterior, I knew that beneath the surface, he was still processing everything that had transpired. He was still trying to make sense of it all. A few minutes later, the girl walked in. She entered the restaurant with the same quiet confidence that had marked her the night before. Her eyes swept the room until they landed on the man sitting at the back. And without hesitation, she walked toward him. This time, there was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. The moment was quieter, more intimate. She sat down across from him, her expression unreadable. And for the first time since their fateful encounter, they were face to face again. I couldn't hear their words from where I sat, but I could see the exchange, an exchange that felt more like a reconciliation than anything else. The man leaned forward slightly, his hands folded in front of him as if he were trying to process everything she had said to him. The girl remained still, her gaze steady, but there was something different in her demeanor now. She wasn't just confronting him anymore. She was giving him space to understand, to come to terms with the past on his own terms. It was a quiet, tender moment, a moment of truth and healing that transcended words. And as I watched them, I realized that for both of them, this was the beginning of something new. It wasn't an easy path they were about to walk, but it was a path that led toward understanding, forgiveness, and perhaps even redemption. In that moment, I understood something that I had never fully grasped before. Sometimes, the most powerful changes in life don't come from grand gestures or sweeping declarations. Sometimes, they come from the quiet moments, the ones where we allow ourselves to face the truth and let go of the past. The air in the restaurant had changed. It was no longer the same quiet, casual atmosphere I had become accustomed to. Something unspoken hung in the air, an invisible tension that seemed to wrap itself around every word spoken, every glance exchanged. The once bustling chatter of diners had quieted, and the soft clinking of silverware was replaced by a subtle murmur of curiosity. People were beginning to notice the exchange at the back table, the billionaire and the young girl. I had been watching them for what felt like an eternity, though only an hour had passed since they sat down. It was clear that this wasn't a conversation about food or pleasantries. No, this was something far deeper, a reckoning, an acknowledgement, an attempt at understanding that transcended their differences. The young girl sat across from the man, her expression calm and collected, but there was an intensity in her eyes. The kind of intensity that spoke of a life lived with quiet resilience, a life shaped by the silent, invisible scars of abandonment and betrayal. The man, on the other hand, was no longer the composed, confident figure I had first observed. He was unraveling in front of me, a man stripped of his armor, exposed to the raw, uncomfortable truths he had spent so many years avoiding. The girl had done something that I wasn't sure anyone could do to him. She had broken through the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart, walls built from years of denial and self-preservation. And now, as they sat there, the conversation had shifted. This wasn't about apologies or guilt anymore. No, they had moved beyond that. It was about something much more profound: redemption, forgiveness, and the slow, painstaking process of healing old wounds. The girl had come to him with the truth he had buried for so long. But the truth, once unearthed, had a way of altering everything. It was no longer just a confrontation. It had become an invitation, a chance for both of them to reclaim a lost part of themselves. "Why did you leave her?" The girl's voice cut through the heavy silence. Her words were direct, but there was no malice in them. It wasn't a question born of anger, but one born from a place of wanting to understand, of needing to understand. It was clear she had lived with this question for years, but now that it was finally being asked, she wasn't searching for an easy answer. She wasn't interested in excuses. She was simply trying to make sense of it all. The man flinched slightly, as though the question had struck him in a place that he had long since buried. His eyes flickered to the side, away from her, as if seeking something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing left but the raw truth that hung between them. "I was afraid," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was young, and I had everything, a future that was set, a life that was already mapped out for me. Your mother, she was a part of a world I didn't understand, a world that I didn't know how to fit into. I thought I could have it all, her and the life I was building. But the more I tried to hold on to both, the more it slipped away. I made mistakes. I chose the wrong path, and in doing so, I lost her. I lost you." The girl didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't forgiveness either. It was something more complex. It was understanding mixed with sorrow. Her mother had been a woman full of life, a woman who had loved him deeply. She had given him her heart, and he had discarded it. And yet, despite the years of hurt, the girl still sought to understand him, not to absolve him, but to recognize that his mistakes did not define her mother's love or her own worth. "You didn't lose me," she said quietly. "I've always been here, just waiting. Not for you to fix things, but for you to see me, to see her, to see the part of you that's still left behind." Her words were gentle but firm, as if speaking from a place of quiet wisdom. "And now, here you are, still struggling with the pieces you left behind. But it's not too late. It doesn't have to be." The man looked at her, a mixture of confusion and longing in his eyes. "What do you mean?" She leaned in slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "I mean that you don't have to keep running. You don't have to keep pretending that your past doesn't matter. It does. And it's not about making things perfect. It's about making things real." The words hung in the air like a soft breeze, carrying with them a weight that was both light and heavy at the same time. It wasn't a promise of grand gestures or fairy tale endings. It was a simple truth. Sometimes, the only way forward is to confront the past, acknowledge it, understand it, and move forward with the knowledge that healing is a journey, not a destination. The man sat back in his chair, his eyes distant for a moment as he processed her words. It was as if a part of him was waking up, something deep inside him that had been dormant for years. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't have to. It was clear he was beginning to understand that the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in years, he was willing to face it. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed after a long silence. "I don't know how to be the man I should have been for her. For you. I've spent so much of my life running from my mistakes. I'm afraid that I'm too far gone." The girl's face softened slightly, and she shook her head. "You're not too far gone. None of us are. I've had to learn that the hard way. The hardest thing isn't admitting our mistakes. It's believing that we can change. But we can. We can always change, as long as we're willing to look at ourselves honestly and take responsibility for the things we've done." Her words, simple yet powerful, struck a chord deep within him. It wasn't a call to perfection. It was a call to growth, to self-awareness, to the understanding that the past didn't define who he was. It simply shaped who he had become. The man had spent so long burying the guilt, the regret, the memories of what he had lost. But now, in the presence of this young girl, his daughter, he was beginning to realize that the key to moving forward wasn't in forgetting the past, but in accepting it. As the conversation continued, it became clear that this was a moment of transformation, not just for the man, but for both of them. They weren't sitting at that table in search of closure. No, they were sitting there because they were finally ready to begin the long, often painful process of healing. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But for the first time, they were willing to take the first steps. The girl, though young, had shown wisdom far beyond her years. And the man, though flawed, had shown a vulnerability that I never would have expected from someone of his stature. They were two people, once lost in their own worlds, now coming together in a shared understanding of what it meant to be human. And as I watched them, I couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. There was so much more to their story, so much more that would unfold in the days, weeks, and years to come. But for now, in this moment, it was enough. The weight of the past had been acknowledged. And perhaps, just perhaps, both of them were beginning to understand that redemption wasn't something you earned. It was something you allowed yourself to embrace. The days following that meeting were a blur of activity for both the man and the girl. Word had spread quickly, and the whispers from the restaurant, where the two had confronted their shared past, had woven themselves into the fabric of their respective worlds. But neither of them seemed interested in the spectacle that had erupted around them. No, this was no longer about public appearances or seeking validation from the world. This was about two people finding something far deeper, something far more meaningful than what anyone else could see. The man, whose name I had never bothered to ask, but whose presence I would never forget, began to change. I saw it in the way he carried himself. There was a new lightness in his step, a sense of purpose that had been absent for so long. He started reaching out to people he had long since shut out, attempting to mend the relationships that he had destroyed in his pursuit of success and control. But it wasn't just about patching things up. It was about being real, being authentic. And in doing so, he began to see the world through different eyes. The young girl, whose name I still didn't know, was equally transformed. She was no longer just the girl who had walked into that restaurant seeking answers. No, she had become a beacon, a quiet force of resilience, grace, and strength that people around her couldn't ignore. She had started to speak publicly about her experiences, not in anger, but with a kind of quiet wisdom that drew people in. She told her story, not as a victim of abandonment, but as someone who had risen above it all and found her own way forward. One morning, A few weeks after that pivotal meeting, I found myself once again sitting in the restaurant, the place where it all had begun. I had returned to see how their story had unfolded, how their journey had continued. And there, sitting at the same table where they had confronted the past, were the two of them, together. It was a scene so surreal, so unexpected, that it took me a moment to process what I was seeing. They were seated side by side, no longer adversaries, but partners in a shared journey. The man with his once perfect suit now a little more casual than the girl, her presence radiating confidence and wisdom, both sat there, talking as if they had known each other all their lives. The distance that had once existed between them had vanished, replaced by something even more precious, an unspoken bond built on honesty, forgiveness, and a deep understanding of one another. As I watched them, I couldn't help but be struck by the profound transformation that had taken place. It wasn't just that they had mended their fractured relationship. It was that they had both found a way to heal, not only their own wounds but each other's. And in doing so, they had given each other the most precious gift of all, the chance to move forward. The man looked at the girl and smiled, a smile that was soft and genuine. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. The girl smiled back, but it wasn't the kind of smile you give someone out of politeness. It was a smile of mutual respect, of shared understanding. "I'm proud of you too," she replied simply. And for a moment, everything in the world seemed to fall into place. It wasn't just about them. It was about the possibility that no matter how broken we are, no matter how many mistakes we make, there's always a chance to start again. There's always a chance to heal, to rebuild, to rise from the ashes of our pasts and create something beautiful. The door to the restaurant opened, and a few new patrons walked in, oblivious to the quiet miracle happening in the corner of the room. But I knew, in that instant, that their lives had been forever altered. They were no longer the same people they had been when they first met. They had each found a new version of themselves, one born of vulnerability, courage, and the acceptance that redemption is not given, but earned. As the two of them sat there, engaged in quiet conversation, I realized that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. There would be more moments, more challenges, more lessons to learn along the way. But what had started with anger and pain had turned into something profoundly beautiful, a connection forged in the fires of truth, understanding, and forgiveness. And as I got up to leave, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rising within me, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we all have the power to change, to heal, and to create a future that we can be proud of. Because sometimes the most remarkable transformations happen not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments where two people, who once were strangers, decide to face their pasts together and build something new. And in that moment, I knew that the world was full of untold stories, waiting to be written. This was theirs, and it was only the beginning. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.